The first 48 hours were crucial. That's what investigators always said. If a missing person wasn't found within that window, the odds of a happy ending shrank significantly. At first, there wasn't much reason for concern. Judge Serafina Calloway was a woman of discipline, structure, and unwavering commitment to her work. Her position in the Texas judicial system wasn't just a job, it was her identity. She had built a reputation for being methodical, unshakable in the face of pressure, and relentless in her pursuit of justice. Long hours weren't just common for her, they were expected. So when a few calls went unanswered, no one thought much of it. Her closest colleagues assumed she was buried in casework. Maybe she was in the middle of a high-stakes ruling, reviewing legal arguments, locked away in her chambers with her phone on silent. Friends, too, weren't immediately concerned. She had just gotten married. Perhaps she and her husband had taken a spontaneous trip, slipping away for a private getaway, a belated honeymoon before life got too busy again. Even her family, the people who knew her best, hesitated before raising the alarm. She was independent, always had been. But then something changed. Serafina was never late for court proceedings. She was never absent from scheduled hearings. She would never ignore the urgent messages piling up from clerks, attorneys, and even fellow judges. And yet she was nowhere to be found. Then came the phone calls, dozens of them, a growing chain of unanswered messages, concerned voices turning into outright panic. The people closest to her could feel it, that something was wrong. Her assistant was the first to take action. When she failed to show up for a scheduled ruling, a case she had spent weeks preparing for, he drove to her home. The house was eerily still, no sign of movement inside. Her car sat untouched in the driveway. The curtains were drawn, the mailbox overflowing with unread letters. It was as if she had simply vanished. By the time the missing person report was filed, law enforcement had already begun working behind the scenes. Calls were made, surveillance footage was pulled. But the more they searched, the stranger the case became. Inside her home, everything seemed untouched. Her purse sat neatly on the kitchen counter. Her keys were in their usual spot. Her phone charger was plugged into the wall beside her bed, as if waiting for her to return. There were no signs of a struggle, no forced entry, no immediate indication that violence had taken place. And yet, she was gone. Detectives began piecing together a timeline. Who was the last person to see her? When did she last send a message? What was she doing in the final hours before her disappearance? The answers weren't easy to find. And then came the first break. A traffic camera captured something unusual. Just past midnight, a vehicle was spotted leaving her neighborhood. A large SUV, its license plate barely visible under the dim glow of the streetlights. It wasn't Serafina's car. It wasn't a known visitor's vehicle. It was a lead. But it wasn't until the discovery of a single piece of luggage, dumped near a desolate stretch of rural highway, that the investigation took a chilling turn. An oversized suitcase, zipped shut, seemingly discarded without a second thought. At first, it didn't seem out of place. Travelers often lost or abandoned baggage, but something about it unsettled the officers who found it. Maybe it was the sheer weight of it, the unnatural bulge stretching the fabric to its limit. Maybe it was the way the zipper struggled to hold its contents inside, as if whatever was inside was never meant to fit in the first place. When they unzipped it, the nightmare began. Inside was a body, bent and broken, forced into an unnatural shape to fit within the suitcase's confines. Limbs twisted at unnatural angles, a face barely recognizable, swollen and bruised. And then came the most devastating revelation. She wasn't alone in death. She had been carrying a child, 4 months pregnant. 2 lives, stolen in an act so vicious that even the most hardened detectives struggled to process what they were seeing. The question on everyone's mind was simple. Who could have done this? The answer came swiftly. The man police placed in handcuffs wasn't an unknown predator lurking in the shadows. He wasn't a nameless figure from a criminal underworld. No, he was the last person anyone expected. The same man who had stood beside Serafina just 2 weeks prior, smiling in wedding photos, holding her hand as they exchanged vows in front of family, friends, and their entire church congregation. A man whose sermons preached about love, devotion, and forgiveness. A man who, until that moment, had been a pillar of faith and morality in Lockwood. Pastor Gideon Merrow, a beloved preacher, a spiritual leader, a man who had spent years standing at the pulpit, delivering messages of righteousness and redemption. Now he was being led out of his home in handcuffs, his face emotionless. No struggle, no resistance, just a blank stare, as if none of this was real. But why? Why would a devoted husband, a respected religious figure, commit such an unthinkable act? Why would he go beyond murder, to break her body, to erase every trace of the woman he once vowed to cherish? The answer wouldn't come from his sermons. It wouldn't come from Scripture. This wasn't just a crime of passion. This was something deeper. And by the time the full truth came to light, the world would never look at Pastor Gideon Merrow the same way again. Because what lay beneath his carefully constructed image of faith and virtue was a man capable of anything. From the outside, Judge Serafina was the kind of woman people admired, the kind they envied, the kind they trusted. At 38 years old, she had spent years carving her name into Texas's legal system, not with scandal or controversy, but with discipline, intelligence, and an unyielding sense of justice. She didn't just sit behind the bench, she commanded it. She had a reputation for being firm but fair, the kind of judge who didn't just enforce the law, but understood the humanity behind it. Attorneys who stood before her knew they had to be prepared. She tolerated no nonsense in her courtroom. But behind the stern rulings, there was a woman who believed in redemption, who saw the system not just as a means of punishment, but as a path to reform. And yet, for all her professional success, Serafina's personal life had always been quieter. She had never been the type to chase after romance. Her focus had always been her career, her goals, her future on the bench. Some whispered that she was married to her work, that she would never slow down long enough to build a family. But then came Pastor Gideon Merrow, a man of faith, a pillar of the community, a preacher whose sermons filled his church to the brim every Sunday. Their story began like a fairy tale. They met at a charity gala, one of those high-profile events where the city's most powerful figures gathered under chandeliers and champagne to talk about giving back to the community. He had been the keynote speaker, a man whose voice carried through the hall, speaking about faith, resilience, and the power of second chances. She had been captivated, not just by his words but by his presence. He was different. In a world of cold legal battles and rigid laws, Gideon Merrow was warm, charismatic, a man who didn't just preach love, he embodied it. Their courtship was fast, faster than anyone expected. Within months, they were inseparable. Sunday church services turned into quiet dinners, late-night conversations stretched until dawn. He spoke of God's plan for them. She believed him. By the time he proposed, there wasn't a single doubt in her mind. This was fate. Their wedding was an event that the entire town of Lockwood, Texas, wouldn't forget. A grand affair, a ceremony fit for royalty. The judge and the preacher standing side by side, promising forever. The guest list was a who's who of Texas elites. Judges, lawyers, politicians, church leaders. Every seat was filled, every eye watching as they exchanged vows. When they said "I do," people wept. And when they kissed, the world saw a perfect match. 2 weeks later, Serafina vanished. And suddenly, that perfect marriage, it wasn't so perfect after all, because behind closed doors, away from the public eye, behind the vows and the fairy tale, there was something no one saw coming. And when Gideon found out, it didn't just shatter their marriage, it ended her life. To the congregation of New Light Baptist Church, Pastor Gideon Merrow wasn't just a preacher, he was a man of God. At 41 years old, he had spent decades crafting a legacy of faith, hope, and redemption. His voice carried through the sanctuary like a force of nature. His sermons weaving scripture and storytelling in a way that left his followers spellbound. When he spoke of faith, people believed him. When he preached about family, they nodded in agreement. When he warned against temptation, they whispered, "Amen." He was a shepherd, a guiding light, a man whose presence commanded devotion. To the men in his church, he was a leader, a pillar of strength, a husband, a mentor, a man who understood the burdens of life and carried them with dignity. To the women, he was the embodiment of faith, a man who spoke of love with conviction and treated his wife with the kind of reverence that made them sigh in admiration. To the children, he was a father figure, a man who knelt to their level and made them believe that goodness still existed in the world. But Gideon Marrow was not just a preacher, he was a man. And men are not infallible. Gideon wasn't born into privilege. His early years were a blur of instability, an absent father, a mother who worked too many jobs, a house where faith was the only thing that never left. As a child, he learned early that the world was cruel to the weak, that people only listened when you spoke with conviction, that the loudest voice in the room was the one that held power. By his teenage years, he had found his calling in the church. He was charismatic, driven, and fiercely disciplined. By the time he was 25, he had built a reputation as a preacher who could bring sinners to their knees. But it wasn't just about saving souls. It was about influence. The more people depended on him, the more power he held over them. And soon it wasn't enough to simply preach about God. He wanted to be seen as a reflection of him. To his congregation, Gideon was a devoted husband, a man who cherished his wife, who spoke about her with reverence in his sermons. To outsiders, the marriage of a preacher and a judge was a union of faith and law, two forces working hand in hand. Serafina was everything he wasn't. Logical where he was emotional, measured where he was passionate. Her presence in his life elevated him, strengthened him, made him whole, and he loved her, truly, deeply loved her. She was the first woman who challenged him, who didn't just admire his power but matched it. She wasn't a meek church wife, waiting in the shadows of his sermons. She had her own pulpit, her own courtroom, her own following. And Gideon respected that. Their love was not the quiet, soft kind. It was fire and steel, two forces colliding and reshaping each other with every battle and every embrace. Their fights were passionate, their reunions even more so. People envied them. They wanted what they had, because to the world they were perfect, a power couple, a testament to faith and justice. And for a time they were, until the night that shattered everything. Until the night Gideon Marrow stood over his wife's lifeless body, his hands shaking, his mind racing, his faith gone. For a man who stood at the pulpit and preached about faith, family, and the sanctity of marriage, trust was supposed to be the foundation of his home. And yet Gideon Marrow had installed cameras inside his own house. Not because he doubted his wife, not because he suspected anything shocking, but because as a man of his status, a preacher with influence, a husband to a powerful judge, he had security concerns. In recent months, there have been unsettling incidents. A string of burglaries in the neighborhood, strange cars idling near their property at odd hours, and once the back gate had been left open when Gideon swore he had locked it. The thought of an intruder slipping in while he and Serafina slept gnawed at him. So without telling his wife, he had quietly installed a set of security cameras. Small, discreet, placed in common areas like the living room and kitchen, never in the bedroom. He wasn't spying, he was protecting them. At least that's what he told himself. For weeks, the footage sat untouched. The cameras blended into the walls, forgotten, their presence unnoticed even by him. Until one evening, when he returned home from church and found the security system glitching. A blinking red light, an error message flashing on the monitor in his study. Frustrated, Gideon sat down to troubleshoot. He clicked through the files, scanning old recordings, looking for when the error had begun. At first it was just routine footage. Serafina in the kitchen, sunlight spilling across the marble countertops, the faint sound of gospel music playing in the background. Then something changed. The timestamp jumped forward. Hours of footage missing. And when it resumed, Gideon's breath caught in his throat. There in the center of his own living room, Serafina wasn't alone. The footage wasn't crystal clear, the angle slightly off, but there was no mistaking what he was seeing. His pregnant wife, another man, another woman. Their laughter, soft, intimate, familiar. The room tilted, the air thickened. His pulse thundered in his ears. At first he thought it was a mistake, that his eyes were deceiving him, that this was old footage, something from before they were together, something that could be explained. But then, the timestamp. It was recent, his body locked in place, his breathing stalled, his pulse a pounding drumbeat in his ears. He could have blinked, looked away, shut the laptop in an instant. But he didn't. He couldn't. Instead, his eyes remained glued to the screen, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was witnessing. Serafina, his wife, his sanctuary, his gift from God, and two others, a man and a woman, their bodies tangled together in a betrayal too obscene to process. Gideon's hand hovered over the keyboard, fingers trembling. He could shut it off, end it before another second of this filth burned into his brain. But something in him refused. He needed to know. How long has this been going on? How many nights had his wife, the woman he had vowed to cherish in the eyes of God, become someone he no longer recognized? His chest felt tight, his vision tunneling as the weight of it all pressed down on him. He inhaled sharply, only to realize his breath had been held for far too long. Did he scream? Did he slam his fists against the desk, send the laptop flying across the room? No, there was no violent outburst, no shattering glass, no primal roar of rage. Instead, there was stillness, a frozen moment where he felt himself break from the inside out. His entire body trembled, his fingers tightening into a vice grip, but his face, his outward expression, remained terrifyingly blank. He didn't call her, didn't demand answers, didn't let the boiling rage spill into a confrontation. Instead, he sat there, hands pressed together in front of his mouth, breathing deeply through his nose. Rage and sorrow twisted within him, forming something unrecognizable. He had spoken so many times about God's tests, trials of faith meant to strengthen a believer's spirit. But this was a different kind of test, a punishment perhaps. But for what sin? Gideon Marrow was a man of routine. His congregation expected him to lead with composure, wisdom, and faith. And so, in the days that followed, he did not falter. Not outwardly, at least. He delivered his Sunday sermon with the same fervor as always, though those closest to him may have noticed the slight strain in his voice. He kissed Serafina on the cheek each morning, shared dinner at their grand dining table each night. But the man inside him was shifting. He no longer touched her in the same way. Where once his hand would rest protectively on the small of her back, it now hovered, detached, hesitant. Where once his voice carried warmth when he said, "Good night, my love," now it was measured, practiced, devoid of any real emotion. And Serafina, did she notice? Did she sense the way his eyes lingered on her longer than usual? The way his jaw tensed ever so slightly when she spoke? Did she catch the moments he seemed far away, trapped inside his own mind, watching her, analyzing, waiting? Perhaps she did, but if so, she never let it show. She had no reason to suspect what he knew. And Gideon? He waited for her to confess, waited for her to slip up, waited for an explanation that never came. Each night he lay beside her in bed, eyes open in the darkness, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing, wondering how easily she slept after what she had done. His resentment festered. It did not explode. It grew slow and insidious, like an infection spreading beneath the surface. The congregation still saw their devoted pastor. Serafina still saw her steadfast husband. But inside, Gideon Marrow was becoming something else entirely. And soon, he would not be able to hold it in any longer. The footage had played over and over in his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, it was there. The grainy images, the hushed sounds, the betrayal unfolding right under his roof. The woman he had vowed to protect, to cherish in the eyes of God, had defiled their home in a way he never imagined possible. For days, Gideon wrestled with himself. He could pretend he had never seen it, bury it like an unwanted memory, and move forward as though nothing had happened. He could confront her, demand an explanation, force her to face what she had done. He could expose her, bring her humiliation to light the same way she had brought shame to him. But none of those choices erased the raw, burning rage clawing at his insides. None of them satisfied the weight pressing against his chest, the sleepless nights spent staring at the ceiling in silence. So one night, he decided. She was in their bedroom when he approached her, his expression unreadable. The room was dim, shadows stretching across the walls. The only sound the faint humming of the ceiling fan above them. He needed to ask her, to confront her in a way that forced the truth from her lips. So he sat at the edge of the bed, hands clasped between his knees, studying her every movement, every breath, every flicker in her expression. When he finally spoke, his voice was eerily calm, but the weight of his words was crushing. At first, there was no immediate reaction, just a brief pause, a heartbeat of silence stretching between them. Then, instead of panic or denial, she remained composed, tilting her head slightly, as if measuring her response. Her reaction was not what he expected. No shame, no guilt, no frantic justifications. Instead, she questioned him, turning the scrutiny back onto him. He exhaled sharply, reaching for his phone. The footage was still there, the damning proof he had watched over and over. He held the screen toward her, waiting for some sign of remorse. A flinch, a gasp, a plea, but she barely reacted. Then a breathy chuckle, a slow shake of her head. The shift was instant. His pulse pounded. His grip on the phone tightened. It wasn't just the act itself, not just the images burned into his mind. The strangers in their bed, the betrayal entangled in the sheets where he had laid beside her for years. It was this, her audacity, the way she deflected, twisting the moment into an accusation against him, as though he was the one who had crossed a line, as though he was the villain in this story. Disgust churned in his gut, the muscles in his jaw clenched, hands curling into fists at his sides. And yet she remained unmoved, her posture defiant, her words cutting deeper than any blade. The realization struck him like a hammer to the chest. He had sacrificed everything, his reputation, his church, his standing in the eyes of God. And for what? She wasn't sorry. She never would be. Something inside him fractured beyond repair. No one would ever know what truly happened in that room. There would be no witnesses to recall the exact moment the argument turned fatal. No one to describe the change in Gideon's face as fury overtook him. The only two people who knew were the ones inside that room, one who would never speak again. Did he lunge at her in blind rage, fingers wrapping around her throat before he even knew what he was doing? Did she fight back, nails clawing at his skin, gasping for air that would never fill her lungs? Or did it happen in an instant, a single deadly blow that left her crumpled and lifeless at his feet? What is certain is that, when the rage subsided, Gideon Marrow stood over his wife's lifeless body, his breath ragged, his hands trembling. The weight of his actions settled on him like a leaden cloak, pressing against his chest until he could hardly breathe. This wasn't punishment. This wasn't justice. This was murder. And now he had a body to hide. Panic set in. The air felt too thick, the walls too close. He pressed a hand to his forehead, his heart slamming against his ribs. What had he done? The minutes dragged into hours as he sat there, staring at her, willing himself to wake up from this nightmare. But no matter how many times he blinked, she was still there, motionless, empty, a reminder that he had crossed a line he could never uncross. Then cold logic took over. He couldn't just leave her here. Someone would find her. Questions would be asked. There would be an investigation, evidence, consequences. He had to get rid of her. No one truly understands what a body becomes until they have to move it. The human form is heavier than it seems, more fragile in some places, disturbingly resistant in others. Gideon struggled to lift her, his breath coming in ragged bursts. Panic clouded his thoughts, his pulse roaring in his ears as he forced her into the confines of a suitcase, one far too small for a human body to fit naturally. The bones didn't break easily. He had to force them, contorting her into an unnatural shape, shoving, twisting, until finally the zipper closed. He had nowhere to take her, no pre-planned destination, no thought-out disposal site. All he knew was that she could not stay here. Under the cover of darkness, he carried the suitcase to his car, placing it carefully in the trunk. He drove for hours, his mind blank, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He needed somewhere remote, somewhere no one would find her. The woods, a river, a construction site where the ground would soon be covered? As dawn approached, he finally found the place, a desolate patch of land, far from prying eyes. He heaved the suitcase out, his arms trembling from exhaustion. He needed to act fast. He dug until his hands were raw, his breath ragged, his body aching. And then he stopped. The sound grew closer, a truck rumbling down a distant dirt road, a stray dog barking in the distance, a car engine idling. Was it real, or was his mind playing tricks on him? His ears strained, his breath caught in his throat. His conscience had been a dull whisper in the back of his mind, but now it roared, twisting his fear into something unbearable. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. His breath hitched as he looked around frantically. He couldn't be caught. Not like this. Heart hammering, he abandoned the half-dug hole, shoving the suitcase behind a cluster of bushes. The shadows would have to conceal it, for now. With one last glance over his shoulder, he turned and fled, his footsteps swallowed by the silence of the night. But the truth had a way of surfacing. And this was only the beginning. When Serafina failed to show up for church that Sunday, few people thought much of it. Perhaps she was ill. Perhaps she had taken a personal retreat. But when she missed calls, texts, and obligations over the next several days, concern began to spread. It was her sister Evelyn who finally took action. After multiple unanswered visits to her home, she walked into the police station and filed a missing person report. At first, the investigation moved slowly. Missing adults weren't an immediate priority, and without signs of foul play, authorities had little reason to escalate the case. But Evelyn was relentless. She reached out to friends, church members, and even local reporters, ensuring Serafina's name wouldn't slip into silence. Soon, inconsistencies emerged. Gideon had told some people his wife had gone to visit family, but Evelyn was her family, and she knew that was a lie. When questioned by detectives, his answers were measured, too rehearsed. There was no concern, no urgency in his voice, just a passive insistence that she had simply left on her own. But as law enforcement pressed deeper, the cracks in his story widened. A search of their home revealed nothing out of place, no signs of a struggle, no immediate evidence of violence. But technology would prove to be Gideon's downfall. His phone records showed no texts or calls to his wife in the days following her disappearance. Odd behavior for a worried husband. His browsing history was even more damning. Late-night searches about decomposition rates, methods of body disposal, and how long before a missing person is declared dead. Then came the surveillance footage. Serafina's car hadn't moved from the driveway, but cameras from a nearby gas station captured Gideon fueling up late in the night. His car weighed down in a way that suggested something heavy in the trunk. His expression was tight, his movements sharp. He was on edge. But it wasn't until they tracked his GPS history that the pieces fell into place. A ping location led them to an abandoned patch of land outside town, where freshly disturbed earth caught the attention of forensic teams. A shallow grave, hastily covered. The suitcase was there, and inside they found Serafina. When officers arrived at Gideon's home, he was seated at his desk, leafing through a Bible. Whether it was a desperate search for redemption or merely an act, no one could say. He didn't run. He didn't resist. He simply closed the book and looked up as detectives stepped forward, cuffs in hand. There was no outburst, no plea for misunderstanding, just a quiet, almost resigned sigh as they informed him of his rights. But as they led him away, one thing was certain. Gideon Marrow had run out of time. When the news of Serafina's murder broke, it sent shock waves through the community. The man they had looked up to, the man who had preached about righteousness and morality, was now standing accused of the most heinous betrayal, the murder of his own wife and their unborn child. At first, some refused to believe it. Gideon Marrow had been a spiritual leader, a man of faith, a respected figure in their town. The idea that he could be guilty of such a cold-blooded act was unfathomable. His congregation was divided. Some clung to the belief that there must have been some mistake, that the system had wrongfully accused him. Others, particularly those who had noticed changes in his demeanor in the weeks before his arrest, began to question everything they had once believed. But as gruesome details of the crime emerged, the suitcase, the broken bones, the child she had been carrying, the tide shifted. The once unwavering faith in their pastor began to fracture. Rumors spread like wildfire, whispers in the church hallways, online discussions dissecting his past sermons for hidden meanings. People who had once defended him now turned away in disgust. The pulpit where he had once stood every Sunday was now a vacant, tainted space. The church removed his name from records, distancing itself from the scandal. His legacy was wiped out overnight. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs demanding justice for Serafina and her unborn child. Local news stations covered every twist and turn of the case, while social media dissected every movement, every expression he made in court. The betrayal cut deep. When Gideon's trial began, the prosecution painted him as a calculating, dangerous man who had allowed his own jealousy and rage to drive him to commit an unthinkable act. His defense team, however, had a different narrative. They claimed he had acted in a moment of blind rage, that he had not planned to kill Serafina, but had snapped after an intense confrontation. The argument was simple. Gideon, a devoted husband and respected preacher, had been pushed beyond his limits by the discovery of his wife's infidelity. His defense attorneys insisted that his religious values, his moral standing, and the sheer shock of the betrayal had led to a temporary break in his psyche. He wasn't a cold-blooded murderer, they argued. He was a broken man, overwhelmed by emotions too powerful to control. They painted him as a victim of circumstance, someone who had given his life to God, his community, and his marriage, only to have it all shattered in an instant. There was no premeditation, they claimed. No murder weapon carefully selected, just a man pushed too far. But the prosecution was prepared. The prosecution wasted no time dismantling Gideon's defense. They presented the surveillance footage, showing him driving late into the night, his car weighed down by something heavy in the trunk. They showed the phone records, the internet searches about body disposal, and the carefully concealed suitcase, proving that this had not been a moment of blind rage. It was planned, calculated, intentional. Then came the forensic evidence. A medical examiner testified that Serafina's injuries showed clear signs of prolonged struggle. The broken bones were not just from fitting her into the suitcase. There were bruises, defensive wounds. She had fought for her life. And then, the final blow. The medical examiner revealed something else. Serafina had been 4 months pregnant. The revelation sent a shockwave through the courtroom. The prosecution seized on this fact. She wasn't just Serafina Marrow. She was a mother. She had a child inside her. And he didn't just kill his wife. He killed their unborn baby. Gasps rippled through the audience. Some wept openly. The jury shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't just rage-fueled murder. This was the destruction of 2 lives. A former member of Gideon's church came forward, testifying that he had once confided in them about his deep-seated anger issues, how he struggled to control violent thoughts when he felt betrayed. It was damning testimony, revealing that this wasn't an isolated incident of sudden rage, but a reality that had been festering unnoticed for years. With each passing day, the evidence stacked higher against him. The jury watched as the prosecution laid out every cold, calculated step he had taken, from the confrontation to the disposal. There was no doubt left. When the jury returned after deliberating, the courtroom was silent. Every breath, every heartbeat seemed to hang in the air. Gideon Marrow sat expressionless, his fingers clasped together on the table in front of him. The judge asked the foreperson to stand. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty." A wave of emotion rushed through the courtroom. Gasps, muffled cries, quiet nods of approval. Evelyn, Serafina's sister, closed her eyes, gripping a small locket that once belonged to Serafina. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, a mixture of grief and relief swirling within her chest. Gideon? He did not flinch. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, telling himself that somehow he would walk free. But now there was no escape, no loophole, no redemption. The judge's voice rang through the courtroom. Gideon Marrow, for the murder of Serafina Marrow and the unlawful killing of her unborn child, this court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Life. The word echoed in his mind, over and over again. The gavel slammed down. It was over. As he was led away in handcuffs, his gaze flickered toward the courtroom gallery. The people who once looked at him with admiration now looked at him with revulsion, pity, or worse, nothing at all. He had spent his life preaching about sin and salvation. Now he would spend the rest of his days behind bars with no salvation left to cling to. The trial had ended, but the impact of Gideon Marrow's crimes rippled far beyond the courtroom walls. Serafina's family mourned not just the loss of a daughter, a sister, a friend, but the future she would never have, the child she would never hold. Her name became more than just another victim in a true crime story. It became a cautionary tale, a warning about the monsters who wear masks of righteousness. The church where Gideon once stood in front of his congregation was never the same. The pews emptied. The whispers never stopped. His sermons, once filled with promises of redemption and faith, now felt like the echoes of a fraudulent man preaching his own lies. Time moved on. The world kept spinning. But some wounds never heal. Gideon Marrow now spends his days behind bars, a fallen preacher with no pulpit, no followers, no power. The life he tried to erase, the unborn child he took, the wife he betrayed, still lingers in the minds of those who knew them. Justice had been served, but justice doesn't bring back the dead. And perhaps the most chilling thought of all, for all his sermons on righteousness, his pleas for mercy, his claims of divine purpose, Gideon Marrow never once in all his confessions, in all his statements, showed a shred of remorse. Not for Serafina, not for the life she carried, not for anyone but himself. In true crime, we often focus on the facts, the evidence, the timeline, the arrest. But beneath every headline is a deeper question. How well do we really know the people we trust? Gideon Marrow was a preacher, a man of faith, a pillar of his community. And yet, behind closed doors, he was something else entirely. So we ask you, how many more walk among us, unseen, unsuspected? How many stories like Serafina's remain untold? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more stories that unravel the hidden darkness behind seemingly ordinary lives, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because in the world of true crime, the truth is always more unsettling than we imagine. And sometimes it's closer than you think.